mentioned Air America. Yeah, that's true. They got paid, but not very much, let me tell you. And then they worked under my shop for a long period of time, and they picked up more pilots than our Jolly Greens did over time in Laos. They were truly heroic, not properly recognized for this.
This T-28 is called, the name of it's called a Trojan. And the Trojan was a very versatile trainer. And because it had so much ability to carry armament, it made a great transition plane to go from trainer into fighter. It's a very strong airplane. It's rugged, very well built, and it's got a lot of history to it.
It would not be an exaggeration to say that news, if not history, was made at this particular Warbirds in Review forum. In this forum, spectators would be introduced to one of the most overlooked and underappreciated airplanes in the history of the U.S. Air Forces, the iconic North American T-28 Trojan, and the part it played in the secret war in Laos, the complicated and clandestine Southeast Asian conflict that began in the 1950s and ran until the U.S. departure in 1973. But it's the presenters who make the Warbirds in Review forums invaluable. Here, this week, on this Wisconsin airfield, spectators will get these amazing stories firsthand from those who actually flew and fought, from those who were not just eyewitnesses to history, they were making history. The T-28 piston airplane was initially developed to replace the T-6, which had been training pilots since World War II. But it became so much more, as owner-pilot Ken Fardy explained to the audience.
This T-28 is called, the name of it's called a Trojan. And this is a C model, which was used for the carrier qualifications. And as you can see, this one is pretty well decked out for combat, but the T-28 had a much different role in the very beginning. It was a trainer. 1947, they needed an advanced trainer to take the place of their retiring T-6s that were teaching pilots to fly in World War II. And they needed something that would simulate the fighter jets that were coming online at that time. The cockpit in the T-28 is very similar, almost identical to the F-86. So it gave them a better understanding of what they were getting into before they actually went into a jet, the early jets. The Trojan was a very versatile trainer, and because it had so much ability to carry armament, it made a great transition plane to go from trainer into fighter. They always had the ability to carry machine guns, rockets, bombs. They even carried external fuel tanks. And eventually, when things started breaking out in Southeast Asia, they realized that they had a great platform, and they took the trainers and they took them back to North American, and they designed what they called the D model for Delta. And what they did was they beefed them up. They gave them extra hard points in the wings. They carried about 3,000 pounds of ordnance, and eventually they actually put ejection seats in them. They had what they call a Stanley Yankee ejection seat. And this plane here is painted in the Southeast Asia camo colors that represents the 1st Air Division, 2nd Fighter Squadron, which is the tiger on the tail, for the South Vietnamese Air Force. It's a very strong airplane. It's rugged, very well built, and it's got a lot of history to it.
Eventually, there were nearly 2,000 T-28s built. Perhaps the main reason they remained such a well-kept aviation secret is because so much of their work was done in secret, such as being the workhorse of the Air Force and CIA in the secret war in Laos, which was fought by men including Dick Welch and General Secord. As an Air Force officer and pilot, and as an officer on loan to the CIA, Major General Richard Secord compiled a notable career working in covert operations, including the secret war in Laos. Our next guest is Dick Secord. He graduated from West Point in 1955, earned his Silver Wings in 56, had a distinguished 28 years as an Air Force officer, has a master's degree in international affairs from GW, finished the programs Air Command and Staff and the Naval War College at Newport. He spent a number of years as an instructor, but then in the early 60s became part of that 1st Air Commando wing, flying AT-28s, hundreds of missions in Southeast Asia. And then in the mid-60s, he was transferred to Udon in Thailand, and that's what we're going to hear about. This is General Dick Secord.
Thank you, David. I started, as he said, flying the AT-28. The Defense Department redesignated this particular genre of 28s, the AT-28, in the early 60s. And it had a number of models, as you've been told, carry about 3,500 pounds of ordnance. I never met a pilot who didn't like this airplane. It was agile, it was strong, took battle damage greatly, and so on. I could go on about it all day.
In a separate interview, General Secord talked about how an Army cadet graduate of West Point ends up in the United States Air Force.
With respect to going in the Air Force from West Point for many years before the Air Force Academy started operations, by agreement right after World War II, when they were forming a separate Air Force, it was the so-called Key West agreements took place, and it stipulated that about 30% of the graduates of West Point and 25% of the graduates of Annapolis would go into the Air Force.
The U.S. Air Force was established in the immediate aftermath of World War II. At a meeting of the service chiefs in Key West, Florida in 1948, an agreement drafted by James V. Forrestal, the first United States Secretary of Defense, outlined the division of air assets between the Army, Navy, and the newly created Air Force.
My first tour of duty in South Vietnam was started in 1962, flying T-28, AT-28Bs at the time. And we were not allowed to log our missions during most of that tour because we weren't there. I guess
what percentage of your missions that you flew were classified?
All of them. The cover was that we were there on training missions. I can honestly say, while I was in Vietnam at least, never flew any training missions.
you explain the politics of why we had to go into Laos, which was a neutral country according to Geneva Accords? So what forced us to go in there?
The Geneva Accords, signed in 1962, neutralized, theoretically, that area. Unfortunately, the enemy did not withdraw at all and, in fact, increased their presence. And although they denied it always, to the end, I think they still denied it. And we weren't there either, and we denied it. So we're both not there.
The Geneva Accords of 1962 were the result of an attempt to return Laos, a nation President Dwight David Eisenhower considered the cornerstone of Southeast Asia, to neutrality. Going back to 1945, when the communist Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence from France, the U.S. and the West held to the theory that a communist victory in one nation in Southeast Asia would quickly lead to communist takeovers in neighboring states. As it became increasingly apparent that the French were failing in their attempt to retake control of the area called Indochina, which the Japanese had occupied during World War II, President Eisenhower attempted to rally congressional and public support for the French by explaining the importance of that area to United States national interests. In a press conference held in April of 1954, Eisenhower coined one of the most famous of all Cold War phrases when he introduced the domino theory. I recall it was President Eisenhower who talked about the domino theory, and as I recall said that Laos was the first domino to fall, and for that reason we had to block the North Vietnamese from Laos. How successful were we?
Well, I think that was the impetus for the 62 Accords, which were signed during the Kennedy administration. And the so-called domino theory was quite prevalent in those times. Whether or not it bore fruit or not is still a subject of debate amongst scholars. But the scholars weren't fighting the war, and we were. And I think we did it effectively. Had we had more reasonable rules throughout, we would have prevailed absolutely. The evidence of that is the 12 days of Christmas in 1972, when our Air Force just pulverized, our Air Force and Army, Navy, aviation pulverized North Vietnam. In 12 days, they had them on their knees. Had we done that 10 years earlier, or 8 years, or 5 years earlier, I think it would have been a different outcome.
Eisenhower said that you have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is that it will go over very quickly. This would lead to disintegration in Southeast Asia with the loss of Burma, of Thailand, of the peninsula, and Indonesia following.
The 1962, while I was in Vietnam the first time, they concluded the 1962 pact, which the U.S. was a signatory to, called the Geneva Accord. Among other things, this series of accords supposedly neutralized Laos. It required the withdrawal of all foreign forces, including specifically North Vietnamese Army and U.S. Army. The U.S. Army had a contingent in Laos as trainers called White Star. Before that time, they had to withdraw them, and we did. The North Vietnamese did not. In fact, they increased their presence and started building what we came to call the Ho Chi Minh Trail, all during this time frame. I went back to South Vietnam briefly in 1966, and then I was on detail with CIA for 3 years as an air officer. They used to call us Christmas help. they needed some airmen, and seemed like an exciting thing to do. So I was able to volunteer for that. No, you're just on loan to the agency. You retain your status as a commissioned officer if you're an officer. The difference is you're in an organization which is legally authorized to do certain operations under Title 50 of the U.S. Code. The military is funded under Title and controlled under Title 10. So you're moving into a more unconventional area. But again, I say you're just on loan. They spent a good deal of time on Geneva Convention strictures with us, but often we didn't wear rank. We wore pretty much what we wanted, especially in the first 3 or 4 months. We were not allowed to log the missions. That continued until about halfway through my tour there. The agency needed some people in their air branch because who were current, experienced tactical pilots, because that's not the way they're structured. They don't have too many fighter pilots on their active ones on their rolls. But they ended up being effectively in charge of the war in Laos. The CI fell heir to that war by default, you might say, because we had to withdraw military forces. We had to react to what was going on, and that was the CIA. And they had many thousands of indigenous so-called troops that they were supporting and trying to train and so forth. And there are 5 military regions in Laos. Just in MR2 alone, where the famous Hmong mountain tribesmen were located. When I first got there, they had 80,000 of them on the rolls. They managed to attrit quite a few of those, but that was, a pretty sizable force. In Laos, there were really 2 different kinds of war. The war on the Panhandle, which was crucial to our interests, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail was, their only supply line really into South Vietnam after they stopped the infiltrations by sea, which was fairly easy. But the truck traffic just grew and grew and grew. And it wasn't just one road, it was a bunch of motorable dirt trails down through jungle and the karst that fanned out all the way along the border. The interdicting that line of communications was crucial, but we never seemed to get that. Mainly, I guess, because the strict reading of the Geneva Accords of '62 prohibited that. But and once again, we played by the rules. The enemy did not.
One of the most heroic groups under the command of General Secord and the CIA in Laos were the Forward Air Controllers, or FACs, nicknamed the Ravens. Writer Christopher Robbins described this covert corps of pilots like this, quote, "The FAC was essential to every aspect of the military operation. It was his job to find the target, order up fighter bombers, mark the target accurately with white phosphorus smoke rockets, and control the operation throughout the time the planes remained on station. The FAC then stayed over the target to make a bomb damage assessment. Putting on a strike meant that you were busier than a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest, the pilot said, unquote. Where else are you likely to meet a legendary Raven firsthand than during a Warbirds in Review?
This is Dick Welch here, and he was a Raven. And there's a little forward in the book that I'm going to read from you here that'll really kind of set the stage of this. The book was about the war in Southeast Asia from 1961 to 73. It says, quote, while America and the rest of the world watched on television a handful of elite Air Force pilots wearing anything but uniforms and piloting unarmored, small, prop-driven aircraft fought a secret war, one that remains secret up to this day. The few pilots who knew about it called it the Other Theater, a small nation called Laos next to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, China and Thailand. These incredibly brave and skilled pilots were known as the Ravens. Fly low, slow, spot the enemy, and direct winged artillery of American airstrikes from South Vietnam, Thailand, and aircraft carriers. Now, that's what they did. That was their mission, and this is one of them. And this is Dick Welch. He has a DFC with 1 Oak Leaf Feather, 13 Air Medals, numerous Laos awards, which he cannot interpret what they are, so he just knows he has them. He flew Covert, and we'll talk about that in a minute, let you explain what that was, in OV-10s prior to the Ravens. So if you can tell them what Covert is.
The Covert was a call sign. Anybody who was in Southeast Asia during that time, it was interesting when you came back and you met somebody, you'd say, what was your call sign? Well, the call sign stayed the same when you left. Somebody, the next people in, they use the same call sign for the same equipment at the same base. So a Covey fac with a first letter of 5 flew into Laos on all his missions. So all my missions, even though half my time was based in Vietnam, all my missions were in Laos.
Just give us a typical mission.
Typical mission would be.
And what time you left, and
typical mission was daylight only. We didn't fly dark. So we'd take off early in the morning, and more often than not, we'd have the coordinates of some place that the CIA, the road team people had identified. There's a building out there full of munitions. And we'd go out there, and you'd fly over it, and it's double canopy, you can't see anything. You could put some ordnance on it, but you probably wouldn't get it, and if you did, they'd just move it, or the next day they'd have guns there. So we would fly over the targets that they had identified. The intelligence is really good. And if we saw an target and opportunity that something was moving, well, we just go to that. But the one I'm thinking about is it was a building as big as one of these hangars. It was in double canopy, and each of the 4 guys at Pak Se looked at it for 2 or 3 days in a row, and finally the agency guys come by, hey, don't you pay attention to us, And he said, well, we pay attention, but if we hang out, they'll put up some guns and shoot us down. So we all took turns going over at different times of the day, and once we were out there, we would stop at these dirt strips and refuel. So you'd leave Pak Se in the morning. It was a place much like this, a paved road and runway and all. If you came to one late in the afternoon, and the CIA guys weren't there, we didn't know if it was in our control. You couldn't land. But anyway, we did get a big building. Finally, the sun was just right, and you could see the ridge building. And we put T-28 napalm on it, and it burned for all day and went up about 3,000 feet. It was mixed munitions for sure, because you could see different kinds of colored smoke and different tracers coming out of it, and it really set them back.
Did you feel like when you finished your tour of duty that you had been effective? That what you guys were doing was
in my
effective?
zip code, yeah, we kept them back on their heels and where I was. This was after we went into Cambodia in May of '70, and the reaction to that was they moved the Ho Chi Minh Trail closer to the people, the Royal Lao and Pak Se that we were supporting. So it became more intense for them, and to keep them back at their old property line, which is about halfway across Laos. Yeah, we set them back.
The secret war in Laos also gave notoriety to another, mostly misunderstood, CIA aerial operation, commonly known as Air America. Unfortunately, much of the public came to know about this unit through that most unreliable of all historical sources, the Hollywood movie. The movie portrayed a shadowy, CIA enterprise involved in activities from delivering the illegal drugs of corrupt Laotian military leaders to black market weapons dealing. The film was a gross disservice to those who risked all in the service of our country and the cause of freedom in Southeast Asia, according to those who were there.
He mentioned Air America. Yeah, that's true. They got paid, but not very much, let me tell you. And they worked under my shop for a long period of time, and they picked up more pilots than our Jolly Greens did over time in Laos. They were truly heroic, not properly recognized for this.
Air America was, in fact, a passenger and cargo airline owned by the U.S. government. Its operating ethos was, quote, anything, anywhere, anytime, professionally, unquote. Its aircraft included the Curtiss C-46 Commando, the Pilatus PC-6 Porter, the de Havilland Canada DH-04, the C-130, and the Fairchild C-123 Provider. Along with the UH-34D, the Bell 204B, 205, and CH-47C helicopters, Air America flew many types of cargo to countries including the Republic of Vietnam, the kingdoms of Laos and Cambodia, and even top-secret missions into Burma and the People's Republic of China.
Well, with respect to Air America, that's a story all its own, and the U.S. government has not recognized them adequately, in my opinion. All these irregular forces over the years with airlift and resupply, all these teams I mentioned that are along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they were resupplied by night airdrops with caribous, the noisemaker, for example. Those are Air America airplanes. Their C-123s did Trojan work. As I mentioned, their helicopter pilots were famous. Most of them were former military people. The myth was that they were very highly paid mercenaries. But I thought they were very lowly paid mercenaries, if you want to call them that, but they weren't paid a lot of money. I know because I ran them for 3 years. And so, effectively, if they didn't run me, they were legendary in my view. So the movie Air America, as I said earlier, was a guy with a hogwash and smuggling drugs and all that. You could never use them as drug smugglers. We had more than 100 CIA officers overseeing them. You know, how long do you think they're going to get away with smuggling drugs under those circumstances? The AT-28 served in combat in all three of the Indochina countries for a long, long time. Everybody knows in Revere's the Mustangs and the Thunderbolts and the P-38s and so forth. Almost nobody knows about the AT-28s, which actually served in combat longer than any of those birds did. So just kind of a pet peeve of mine. The pilots who flew these airplanes were exceptionally bold, and casualty rates were significant, no doubt, but the damage that they wrought was just disproportionate to their numbers. We only had about 100 of these airplanes at any given time.
how could we have prosecuted it more effectively?
Interdicted the Ho Chi Minh Trail with troops rather than trying to do it with forward air controllers and tactical air, and struck north as we did in Linebacker 2 at the same time, it would have been over in a fortnight. Those two actions simultaneously would have put them back decades. I mean, they would have tossed the towel in faster than you could say your name, in my opinion. The United States lost that war. I've heard a lot of people try to argue that no, we didn't really, in the bigger picture, what developed thereafter, rapprochement with China and so forth, proved that we really won the big war. That's just hogwash. We lost the war, but we lost it politically. There's no question about that. But the war really had been going on, the shooting war had been going on for, 13 years that I've described so far. The American body politic is famous for having a fairly short span of support when it comes to warfare, especially with American troops. And there were a lot of casualties in that war. 58,000 men killed in that war. No small thing. And the one thing that our foes, potential enemies, understand is power. They understand that. They understand it very well. They understand it in the Middle East. They understand it throughout that region. If you want to play the game of nations, you've got to have all the instruments necessary. It's not just diplomacy, not just intelligence, but you've got to have the military. And you can have the best military around, which I think we probably do, ounce for ounce, dollar for dollar. I think we do. But if you don't have the political will, then you're whistling Dixie.
I grew up in Bremen, Georgia, about an hour west of here. Graduated from high school there. Came to Georgia Tech 1952. Met Pat Epps along the way. We graduated in 1956. I had been accepted for pilot training with the Air Force after ROTC, but was delayed for a year on that to go on active duty. So I worked for Lockheed out here in Marietta. And then in 1957, I entered pilot training down in Bainbridge, Georgia. I was very fortunate, flew first group that flew the T-37. Went from there to Laredo, Texas, T-33, and got my wings. Came back to Moody Air Force Base flying F-86Ls.
What put you on a track to go into ROTC and then into the Air Force? Is that something you wanted to do since you were a kid, or when did that kick in for you?
Well, growing up during World War II, formative years, I heard about these guys, flying tigers, running around China, strafing trains and doing things in the big raids. And I thought that must be really neat. But I never thought I'd get a chance at it until I got to Tech and found out there was ROTC and that I could have a chance.
And what made you choose Tech?
Probably because of the football team right then. Plus, my next door neighbor was a ham radio operator, and he convinced me that if I went to Tech and got an electrical engineering degree, my future was secure.
At what point in your Air Force career did you get introduced to the F-105?
I was in graduate school at Southern California in 1965-66. And while I was there, I was thinking I'm going to miss out on this war because I had a lot of friends that already had assignments. But I received an assignment at the time before I finished out there for the 105. And the sequence of events was I'd go to survival school at the completion and then to Nellis Air Force Base and check out in the 105 to go to Tak Lee, Thailand.
So when you were at Nellis, how often did you get into Las Vegas?
Surprisingly, I didn't go down there as much as you'd think during that time. We were pretty busy. I went out a few times to make sure I wasn't going to win any extra money.
Tell me as much as you can remember about your journey to Vietnam. How did they get you over there? Did you fly an airplane over there, or did they ship you some other way? Just tell us about going to Vietnam and your first impressions of being there.
Okay. I left from Fort Walton Beach, Eglin Air Force Base, in the end of March of 1967. I flew commercially to San Francisco and then up to Travis Air Force Base, where I was on a military contract flight that island hopped to the Philippines, Clark Air Base, and I went through jungle survival school there for about 10 days. And then I flew again on a contract flight to Bangkok, and then on a military airplane, C-47, the old Goonie Bird, up to Tak Lee.
And what do you remember about stepping off an airplane for the first time?
I had a very memorable introduction. The fellow who was the ops officer for my squadron and the one that became my flight commander subsequently said, "Welcome to the 354th, the highest loss rate squadron in Southeast Asia." I said, "Yeah, what a good deal." And about a week later, I went up and met with the wing commander who welcomed the new people. And he told us that in 2 years of operation, the track record was in the 100 missions or 1 year tour, you had a 50-50 chance of being shot down. If you were shot down, you had a 50-50 chance of being rescued. Welcome to the war.
Most pilots are in love with the airplane that they flew, but some of those loss rates had to do with the airplane you were flying, correct?
The loss rate, I think, was primarily the mission. But backing up, when I was in graduate school and we knew people were getting assignments, I had volunteered or indicated an interest in every airplane in Southeast Asia except the F-105. And that was based on a briefing from Colonel Yeager when he was head of the test pilot school. He described it as an electronic monster. Can't understand why the Air Force wasted their money on this thing. So I was not particularly happy when I got my assignment. But by the time I checked out in the airplane, started flying it, I started to really like it. By the time I left to go to war, I won't say I was in love with it, but I was proud I was flying it. And the more I flew it, the prouder I was. But our mission since we only flew in North Vietnam, made us extremely vulnerable. We didn't have much, what do we say, milk runs. Maybe on a bad weather day you'd do a recce down in Route Pack 1 north of the DMZ, and that was pretty easy, but I was on my 47th mission, and 31 of them were in the Hanoi area. I'd already beaten the odds 2 or 3 times. I never got to meet Colonel Oles, but he was the commander of the 8th Wing over at Ubon when I was flying, and they flew MiG-Cap on several missions into Hanoi that I was on. But I did not meet him personally until after the war.
So, obviously your missions were into dangerous territory, and I've read that, well, I won't get into reasons, but because of our unwillingness to stop the stuff coming in from the Russians, they had a very robust anti-aircraft defense system. So, I imagine every mission was just tremendously high risk.
There were a few missions, like when we would do road recce or just general reconnaissance missions down in the lower route packs 1, 2, or 3, that were you almost say were fun. Get out and roam around and see the countryside while you were doing it. But yes, when we went into the Hanoi area, the expression was when you got up there, your ass belongs to Uncle Sam. Put those bums on target. And there were some missions that everything is there. We went in, at the time I was there, we'd make run-ins at low altitude, around 1,500, 2,000 feet, to try to stay out of the radar for the SAMs and the radar guns. Therefore, small arms fire was a risk that you had to avoid. But yeah, in the pattern that we flew, we'd pull up to about 14,000 feet and then come back in on a dive. And that's when the radar could pick you up. Where the first month or so I was there, where the MiGs would be laying for us right over Hanoi. And one mission I was on, we had MiGs going up with us in the pop. You had 105s and MiGs and 105s and MiGs, and SAMs going off and flak all around. I don't know who the MiG leader was that day, but he wasn't too smart. Oh, you could almost watch a gauge drop. I used to laugh. Said, put your hand on the floorboard, you could feel it going by. I'm trying to think. Typical fuel consumption was probably about 3,000 gallons or pounds an hour. The afterburner jumped to a little over 6,000.
So you didn't do that unless you meant it.
No. The best I did, I guess I got it about 1.3 or 4. But that's an interesting story if you want to put on.
Yeah, go ahead. I'd love to hear it.
We were on a mission on Sunday afternoon in a railroad yard just northeast of Hanoi across the Red River Bridge there. And my flight leader, we were the number 1 bomb flight, and there was a flak suppression flight ahead of us, and the number 4 guy there had been hit and was going down under the clouds. We had about a 2,000 foot level layer. And so my flight leader says, I'm going to follow him down. So that meant me leading the mission out. And about the time I got out and got to recover right across Hanoi, and that's where we were in Afterburner, accelerating out of there and jinking. A SAM went off so close that I flew through the colored cloud, which only lasted a couple of seconds. And I came back and I told him that day, I said, I think the biggest damage I did was going across Hanoi supersonic, blowing out all the windows in town. But as we got out, I was starting to climb out, and a fellow from up here in Georgia who happened to be in my squadron too, I recognized his voice, called me and he says, single 105, 18 east of 97, shake it, you got a MiG on you. So I did a split S right down through the cloud layer, pulled up, and when I did and looked out, there was a mountain ridge on either side of me out here, at least 500 feet higher than me. And I came back out of there rather subdued, to say the least. And I remember I got back and went through debriefing. And intelligence at that time, if you had a tough mission, they'd pull out this bottle of bourbon, old Overholzer, I remember, and they'd give you a shot. And I threw that one down, and I started telling him about the mission. He pulled us, "So you like another?" And I said, "Yeah." And I says, "Can I have another one?" I had my third shot of bourbon. We got through the debrief, and I looked at my watch. It was about 5 minutes till the evening church time. And I went down to the chapel, and I knew this Methodist minister was down there, and I leaned up and right up in his face. And I said, "It was a close one today, but he got me back here." I said, "You think I'll be okay here?" He says, "You'll be glad you're here. Come on in." But that was probably my most exciting day, other than being shot down.
I guess a day you probably don't enjoy talking about, but I hope you will. July 5th, 1967, and maybe I'd love for people who, particularly young people, to understand what your day was like. Not just the fact that you were shot down, but your usual day and preparing for a mission, and all you can remember about that day would be wonderful.
I don't have any trouble talking about it. July the 5th, 1967 was obviously a very special day, and 2 or 3 things led up to that, in that I had just been appointed or signed as the executive officer of the squadron, and we were having an inspection. We had a new commander. He asked me to do a check around to make sure we were ready and get acquainted myself. So I had not flown for 3 days. I had sat as spare when they needed, but I didn't get off. And I remember on the night of the 4th of July, I wrote a letter home, and I said, "Well, I missed the fireworks again today, but Fergie promised me tomorrow for sure." And sure enough, I went out on the afternoon mission. I dropped that report off on the commander's desk and headed out. And later on, talking to people in Hanoi when we were together, almost without exception, all of us acknowledged there was something different about the way we felt that day. We couldn't put our finger on it, but it wasn't like a normal day. And I kept trying to think the whole time, what have I forgotten? What did I do or not do, or what? And as it turns out, obviously it was that sense, I guess, of the impending, what was imminent. But in my case, I was the number 4 airplane in a second flight on a railroad siding right up near the Chinese border. And just as we started our roll-in of the first flight, there was a call for MiGs about 20 miles west of us at our altitude. So as number 4, that's part of my responsibility. So I took a quick look out there to see if I could pick them up. And I didn't see anything, but when I looked back, my leader had already started rolling in, and the flak was so thick that I couldn't see down, so I had to stay up till some bombs went off and I could see the target. Consequently, I had to adjust my roll-in. Instead of being in a 45-degree dive, I was probably at least 60 coming straight down, and I had to adjust the altitude, drop the bombs. And I flew through 3 levels. They were laying out flak at level 3, about 3,000 feet apart. I made it through the 3 of the levels of flak. But just as my bombs came off, I felt a hit. I'd been hit twice before, so it was unmistakable. But this time, my procedure was, when I dropped the bombs, was hit the afterburner, pull out, let that give me the thrust, and start my jinking. Well, when I hit the afterburner, the airplane just did a tumble. And I came back out, it stabilized, and I remember this distinctly. Boy, that'd be a heck of a ride at Coney Island. I'd never been there, but I'd heard about it. So I relaxed, put the burner back in, get out of here, and the airplane just started flipping and tumbling. And I couldn't see out because of the flames, but I was still going to try to make it as close as I could to the water. We'd come in off the Gulf, and we're going back out that way. But about that time, the camera up in front of the dash, under the windscreen, broke loose, and I had to duck as it went over my head. And as I was looking, the instrument panel just started crumbling, and the airplane was starting to come apart. So I leaned back, put myself in position, pulled the handles, and I remember thinking nothing happened. Boom, it's gone. And I had a very interesting experience in that I grayed out. I couldn't see anything, didn't feel anything. I was just kind of floating. I thought I was dead, literally. And then I started feeling some pressure, and my vision started coming back, and I could see a little bit of green. And then all of a sudden I could see the canopy of, the tops of the trees, and I'm coming down. And I looked up to see if the canopy was open, and it was just starting to blossom. And I reached up to get it, and when I put my hands on the risers, they collapsed. I was sitting on a log on the ground. And that all took less than 2 seconds, because had those automatic systems that got me out, pull to shoot, not worked, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. I figure I went out inverted in negative G's and probably maybe even ejected toward the ground. I don't know. No idea. But somebody up there was looking out for me that day again, like the day that over Hanoi supersonic.
You're not any place you want to be.
Well, the first thing, obviously, that I did once I was on the ground, sitting on the log, my emergency beeper was going off. Get that off so I can talk. But I couldn't get up to it. I couldn't get it cut off. I didn't think. I realized after the fact that I had, because 2 others had been shot down, and their beepers were the ones that were going off, blocking things. But I made an immediate call. Told them I was down safe. I'd check in an hour. That's really optimistic. But sitting on the log looking down was kind of ironic. I looked down and looked at the tree. This is just like North Georgia. Those hills, same kind of scrub trees and pine trees running around, the ground's gravelly. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me, these ain't going to be friendly North Georgia mountaineers. Everybody I see now may be looking to kill me. So I started trying to get rid of stuff. My chute was caught in the trees. I couldn't get it down. My survival kit that comes out separately had banged down, and I couldn't get it open. But I could get the side open that had the jungle hat with a mosquito net and a bottle, 2 cans of water. And I pulled out the water, stuck them in my flight suit, put the hat on, threw my helmet down the hill, hoping that would make them think I'd gone that way. And I started up the hill, which was the instructions or recommendations from survival school. And as I got to almost to the top of the hill, and I could see a path out here that I was going to go to, I hesitated just long enough. I think actually my G-suit got caught in some brambles and kept me from pushing these bushes open. And a Vietnamese ran across closer than 4 feet away. The only thing, he was in a hurry or didn't look my way. So that caused me to look around a little bit and the path, and then I saw these field wires across the way. When I leaned up and looked, I'd come down right in the gun ring. There was a gun sight down here about 100 yards and another one over here about 150. And so I reconsidered my actions at this point, don't get too carried away. But I managed to get across that path without leaving a track with the boots. And I thought if I got over on the other side and down the hill, I could hide out for that hour and check in and maybe get picked up, get out of here. And I didn't realize when I got across, all the brush was over here. I was in grass, maybe a foot and a half high. And when I got to the edge and looked down, it was a drop off into a bog. I wasn't going anywhere in that direction. So I sat down and opened one of the cans of water, and at that point I was so thirsty I didn't think there was enough water around. I took 2 sips and I thought it was going to come out my ears, all the psychological, the shock effects. But I managed to drink it, forced it down, threw the can away, and about that time I heard voices and were gathering up over here along the trail. And they were pointing and talking, and I'd heard some shots and hollering back and forth. They'd obviously found my parachute and helmet. And so they'd eliminated that side. They just really were going to come over here. And they did, and they came out. And I did this and tried to get anything white out of sight and hide down. But I turned out I wasn't going to hide under anything. They walked up and tapped me on the shoulder and welcomed me to North Vietnam. The ones that came out and got me were actually militia. They were in civilian clothes. One of them had a rifle.
I don't mean to interrupt, but these are regular North Vietnamese.
No, these are civilian. They're like militia.
Oh, okay.
They're in civilian clothes. I don't know how they fit into the system right there then, but like I say, one of them had a rifle, and they started stripping me down. And of course, when I got my pistol out over here, one of them pulls it out and looks at it. And I don't know why, it was just a sixth sense. I just happened to glance up just as he was starting to come across and hit me in the head, and I ducked and missed him. And the guy with the rifle leaned across and hit him with a butt in his chest and knocked him back. And I remember thinking, you and I are going to be friends. I don't know about the others, but I like you. But they packed me down. Well, they started me, took off my boots, stripped out everything out of the flight suit. One amusing thing, I carried a half a pack of Salems because we'd been told that Ho Chi Minh liked those, and if Ho Chi Minh did, most everybody else probably would. And I carried some Winston cigarettes too. They pulled the cigarettes out, looked at them, crumbled them up, and threw them away. And I said, well, so much for intelligence. But they started walking me, and I realized if I walked very far barefooted, my feet were not going to be in a condition to do anything else. So as we started down the trail, I started watching, and I saw a root coming up, and I hooked my foot in it and fell over and convinced them that I'd hurt myself. And I got them to carry me all the way down the side of the mountain. And we stopped in a little village. They put me in a house in the back corner on a bed. And I was there, I'd say, between 30 minutes and an hour. And he came in, tapped out, and walked back out. And I got in this, I called it a safari wagon. It was bigger than a Jeep, but not as big as you see safaris nowadays, but open vehicle with a canvas top. And they put me in the back seat, one guy on each side. They're holding my arms like this, so I wasn't tied up. But I looked up as the fellow on my left in English said, "You're now the prisoner of the Chinese Liberation Army." And what I saw in front was a picture of Mao Zedong and Lin Pao, head of the premier and the head of the People's Army. And I couldn't put my hand up and do the Marine salute, but I said something, well, okay, you really did it to yourself this time. Because I figured I was gone to China because we were that close to the border. I learned over the next 24 hours that that's why the gun sights were so good down there. The Chinese were running them all. And what we had rolled in over, literally, that got us was what we considered probably the best gun sight in North Vietnam. Of course, now I knew why. And later, in '79, when Deng Xiaoping came to this country, he acknowledged that they had 300,000 regular troops in North Vietnam for the war. So that's what they were doing. And it was also why we had been briefed about 2 or 3 weeks before that there would be no attempted rescues in the buffer zone right up near the border. That they finally acknowledged that those were the Chinese. And I'd have to say that overall, I was well treated with them. They brought me something to eat. They wanted me to do a radio broadcast, which I declined with no pressure. And that night, the commandant came in. They introduced him as the commandant. And through the translator said that if I cooperated with them, that I would be treated well, and I'd be taken to Beijing and be treated well. And I declined that kind offer also, because in 1967, Beijing and the moon were about the same distance from Atlanta, Georgia, as far as I was concerned. I did not know, I should say, that we had an F-104 pilot had been shot down in September of '65 who was already in Beijing. And he came home when we did, and I introduced myself to him and told him my opportunity to meet him. He said, "You made a good choice." He spent 7.5 years in solitary. And after during the 24 hours with the Chinese, when I knew, they took me around the next day to various gun sites. We'd stop someplace, and about 8 or 10 guys would come out in uniform and line up. And I called him the cheerleader. The head guy would get out his little red book, and he'd read and chant and read, and he'd chant. And the translator then would say, "The U.S. will surely be defeated. The Vietnamese people will surely be victorious." Okay, that's nice. And one thing out of that, which really surprised me, was that almost every one of these guys had a camera. And when the chanting and cheerleading was all over, they'd all gang around. They're all making pictures. So I had my fingers crossed that somebody was going to make a picture to get out, because I knew with my close call I was probably going to be reported as killed in action. So I cooperated with the picture making at that point as much as possible. But that afternoon, they took me up to a place, I guess it was either a subordinate or a corresponding headquarters, where I met some more regular Army. And I had, I guess you'd say, a test of wills. They started the chanting again, and this time they wanted me to say it. And I told them, no, I'm not going to say that. And one of the guys, I don't know what they smoked, but his eyes showed he had something more than issue, maybe even old Overholser. But he comes up with his rifle and puts the bayonet right under my chin and pops it up like that, while the translator's right here saying, "You must say it." And I wouldn't shake my head. I just did kind of like that. And after 2 or 3 times like that, and for him saying, "You must say it," I finally just did my lips tightly. I grinned, so I'm not going to say that. And an officer obviously came up and got this guy to back off with a rifle. But I wasn't too sure there for a while, because I could see the rifle bore was clean. It was operable. But once that was over, back in the truck, back down to where I'd been before, in an area with a cave. That was my house right then. And they let me take a nap, and the commander came by and motioned like that, and went out and got in the truck and went down, and they turned me over to the North Vietnamese. And I remember when they made that offer and to go to Beijing, I said, no, I want to go to Hanoi. The guy looked at me and just kind of shook his head. So when he turned me over, I laid back out, and I wanted to shake hands with him, and we did, which is part of the story, because I hope to meet him later on. But anyway, the Vietnamese blindfolded me, and took me down, I'm pretty confident, to Kep Airfield. And I got a jet helicopter ride into Gelam, right downtown, and then a truck ride across the river to the big prison, Royal Lao. We refer to Royal Lao as the Hanoi Hilton.
Oh, that's the Hanoi Hilton.
But also,
Yeah.
Hanoi Hilton tends to encompass all the camps. If you were in Hanoi, you were in the Hilton.
Oh.
Although everybody, with few exceptions, processed through the big prison initially. And I went into New Guy Village there, learned I wasn't nearly as big, mean, and tough and strong as I thought I was. A couple of little fellas with a rope can get you to do and say things that you didn't plan to. And another one that got my arms up behind me for the better part of a day, convinced me to do some things. It had been opened in, I think, summer, June, July area, '66. And they called it the farm because out the edge of town, and you could hear the chickens and the animals and things around, and they named the buildings for things like the barn and the stable and the chicken coop. And it was an old French movie studio, so there was a theater there, that was obvious. They had a swimming pool, and one was a pool hall. So all those names fit in. But one of the guys that was living in front of the pool hall was a real character. One day, well, almost all the doors had these little openings in them. We call them peeps for short. And that's what they'd open up and look, check on you every morning and during the day or at night or whatever. One of the guards came by one day and did that. And after he walked off, this fella tapped his neighbor next door, says, "The first zoo I've ever been in where the animals look at the people." And from then on, it was the zoo. After the zoo, sometime during the summer of '70, the Vietnamese were readying a new facility for us at an existing army post out again to the west of Hanoi. And they had moved at least 2 groups in there earlier. One of them from the from the San Tay prison where the raid took place later on. But it was the first time we had compound living, so to speak. It was a big, long barracks that was divided into several rooms. Excuse me. But after a few days, we were all out together. They'd come in, just unlock the doors in the morning. We had to run to the place till siesta time, noonish, when they'd put us back in for a couple hours, and then we'd back out. We had to run to the place till time to lock up to go to bed. We had a latrine area and a wash shower area. It definitely, it was not Hogan's Heroes, but it was so much better than anything we had had. We were getting sunshine, exercise, and then the Sante raid popped in, and that was about 6-7 miles away. We heard all the fireworks and see the airplanes and activity, and it scared the bejesus out of the Vietnamese. 2 days later, we were all loaded up, now taken back down to the big prison, Royal Lao, downtown. And they had opened up an area in the back that we knew was back there because when I was there before, we could hear people back in there. They'd been using it for political prisoners as well as South Vietnamese prisoners they'd captured. And these cell blocks were roughly 25 feet by about 55 or 60. And they had up to 100 to 120 South Vietnamese in each one, and there were 50 to 57 of us in each one. And on the concrete slabs, you had about that much space. And we then had guys laying on bedboards around on the floor. It was a crowded sardine can, but it was so nice to be with people that you'd only heard names of for several years, but now you got a face to go with them, a personality, and you got new people to talk to and these stories to hear. And it was actually fun for a few days. The first stop that I made when we went out to the zoo was in an area that we called the Annex. There was a series of buildings, I think there were 9 or 10 of them, where they stored the film from the studio. And in fact, there were old rolls of film around and so on. And I was in this group of 3 other F-105 pilots that had been shot down in early October. We'd gotten there in late October. But none of us knew anything about the tap code. We'd tried to talk across the wall or do something to the group that was next to us. There were 2 units in each building. But we weren't getting anywhere until the next spring, like March. This Navy lieutenant commander came in who knew the code. He had heard it, but he hadn't had a chance to use it, wasn't very good at it. But we were over trying to get the guys next door to respond. And he was tapping on the wall, and we were giving names, and they were giving their names back.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir, but how did the code work? Was it a form of Morse code, or
No.
How'd you know which letter was what tap?
Well, the quick background is one of the very early Air Force officers, I think he was number 6 or 7, shot down, had been talking to a German POW, one of ours who was a German POW in World War II, and talked about this code. And Smitty asked him, "What is it? Is it Morse code?" "No, it's a little matrix, 5 by 5. Excuse me. You drop out the letter K because you can get the same sound using a C. It's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, right on down. And to tap it, you tap, the first tap is for the row, and the second tap's for the column. So a B would be 1, 2, 2, and my initial W, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, dot, dot. A, dot, dot. And it seems cumbersome till you get it and get going. And once you get established doing it, it's like a lot of other things. You pick up a word from the context and you can get them to go on. And you can do it even faster than the telegraph key, I think. It was a lifesaver for us. But this first effort was really cumbersome. And when they were given their names back, this one came out, as I mentioned, there's no K, you use the C. It came back H-I-C-C-E, something that doesn't make any sense. So you get him an error and get him to do it again. And about the third time, I don't know why it popped in my mind. I said H-I-C, and then all of a sudden I remembered saying, ask if that's Jim. And so he went back, Jim, it came back, yes, and it's Jim Hickerson. And we had been fraternity brothers down here at Georgia Tech, stood side by side at initiation. He went in the Navy right away when I had that delay at Lockheed, but we'd seen each other about 2 years after. Both of us had our wings, but that would have been 10 years later right there in Hanoi. But it was after he and I were then moved, as we call it, across the wall into the main prison. He was up in the barn and I was in the pool hall. So we didn't communicate until about 2 years later when we had what I call a fruit basket turnover, and he moved in next door to me and had taken some of the bricks out of the windows, and I got to lean in and shake hands with him. But then when we went out to the camp we call Faith at the compound living, and then back into the other, we stayed together for the next 2.5, almost 2 years.
Thinking about the whole experience, you had to go through a range of, I shouldn't say you had to, I would imagine you went through a range of emotions.
Definitely.
In the beginning, you're a new opportunity for them. And then there must reach a point where the enemy says, we've done everything with this guy that's of value to us we can do, and now you just become, I shouldn't say just become, now you're a prisoner. When you think back, I mean, there had to be fear, boredom, hunger. I mean, how do you describe the stages of your imprisonment and what it did to you?
Well, first off was the startling realization that Air Force intelligence at survival school was out of touch with the real world. Because I asked the question as part of the process, what do you know about the POWs? You're probably aware of the Hanoi March that had happened in the summer of '66. Oh, and by the way, one of the Navy guys was shot down a couple of days before that happened, and they put him in. He got down and got to the prison, and his quote was one of the famous ones. He said, "You guys do this very often?" But I was concerned about it, and the sergeant told me in the Philippines, "Oh, we've had reports of really good treatment up there." Says they've been seen out in town at night in restaurants and theaters and stuff. And I'd been there about a week when I settled down enough, wish I could get my hands on that sergeant again. And also a Marine from Korea. But anyway, I was not prepared for the immediate torture, to be candid. Obviously, in survival school, we were taught name, rank, serial number, date of birth, according to the code of conduct, and evade further question to the best of your ability. But a German POW fellow, U.S. Air Force, who had been German POW when I was there, made the statement that if you have something that they want, they will get it. If you're by yourself, they'll get it out of you. If they're more than one, beware of things they'll do to play you off each other to get it. So once I got to the name, rank, serial number, date of birth, and he said, "What was your target?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "What do you mean you don't know?" And his English wasn't that good, but I could understand it. But I used the fact that I couldn't to get him to repeat things, to buy time to think about what I was doing and saying. But anyway, he let me know right away that name, rank, serial number is not going to cut it. Oh, in fact, that's one of the humorous things. I told you about faking that injury up in the mountain to get them to carry me. I tried the same thing with the Chinese. They brought in a doctor. He checked me out. Said, "No, you're okay." I said, "No, no, you're okay." When I get to Hanoi, now I'm in a new venue. So when the interrogator comes in, he says, "Sit." And he was at a table with this light little gooseneck thing down here with a stool down. He says, "Sit." So I start like I'm going to hobble over there. And he looks up and he says, "Maybe you best actor in survival school, but now you in Hanoi. Sit down." That alerted me. This guy is not a dummy. He's in touch. And over the course of the night, he convinced me that their intelligence was immediately up to date. He asked me 2 questions over the course. One I'd been briefed on it the day before I was shot down, and one the day I was shot down as top secret. And he asked me why this happened. First one was why the 104 or the F4s no longer fly MiG cap. And I said, "You mean they weren't up there today? I thought they were." And then he says, "Why can you not fly over Hanoi below 10,000 feet now?" And we'd just been briefed on that day because there's a French delegation in town. So once that confirmed that I got to be serious about this. And when he was asking these questions, "What was your target?" I said, "I don't know. I was a spare. I pulled in. I just followed them." Who else was in your flight? I don't know. Who's in your squadron? Well, I'm new. I've only been there a short time. He kept pressing for names, so I started coming up with guys from high school and from tech who were 4F or never in. I threw in some names of guys that had finished 100 mission and gone home to be good. And I kept cranking this, and finally, after I don't know how many hours, and several times of tying me up and passing out and coming back to consciousness, he said, "Why you keep lying?" I said, "I'm not lying." He said, "Yeah, you lie. Same day we shoot down man 357 Squadron, tells us everything." And I thought about that a minute, and I said, "Well, if he tells you, why you ask me?" He said, "I want to hear you say." So we're back to the game again. Name, rank, serial number, write down all the same questions. And I remembered from survival school, if you're telling a lie and somebody else telling the truth, the liar's in trouble. And I thought, oh gosh, if he really did tell them, I'm in trouble. So I started pulling my answers back to more factual things, but not quite as best I could, but sweating it out. And finally, when he quit about daylight, and this had started a little after dark the night before, and I got the day off, and I lay there, and they brought me some soup and rice to eat, and I got to thinking, he really conned me. He played all those things they told me about in survival school. He did it, and then I bought it hook, line. There ain't nobody else up here now. There you go. And I never heard any reference about another guy till I got to the zoo with those new 105 pilots. And one of the guys had been at the other base at Covert. And he said, I knew about you. You were shot down the same day as Ward Dodge. And he was a flight leader in another squad. I said, what do you mean? He said, yeah, he and another guy were shot down that day. They were 357th Squadron. So, yeah, they had the guy. They put him out as died in captivity about a week later. And once I got through the fear, and I mentioned the next day when I said he really hooked me, I got to shape up here and start earning my pay as a major in the United States Air Force. They came in the next morning and says, today you write your autobiography. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's Dakota Tunka. You won't write. He says, I'll order you to. I said, I don't take orders from you. None of these guys wore rank. so you didn't know who you were talking to really, but they all look like kids. As you know, Orientals tend to look much younger than they are for a long, long time. But we went through that, and they said, well, I bring in a camp commander. He orders you to write. And I said, okay. So he goes, and I was really being this flippant and blasé, no kidding. So he comes back in a few minutes with a guy about his age, same size. He says, now, this is the camp commander. And I said to myself, oh, yeah, this was Saturday morning. I said, oh, yeah, these guys were out drinking beer last night. They said, oh, we're going to have some fun with a new guy. He asked, will you write your autobiography? I said, nope. He talked in Vietnamese. He says, he asked you one last time? I said, no. He talked to me. He says, he orders you to write your autobiography. I said, I take my orders from the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. He talked a little more in Vietnamese, and he says, one more time? I shook my head. And the camp commander looks up in very good English and says, you will be very sorry. Got up and walked out. 2 or 3 minutes later, this big guy comes in, biggest Vietnamese I saw. And they put me on the ground, pulled my arms back up behind me. I couldn't do it again. My life depended on it. My palms were together behind my neck. I could scratch my neck. And they put Vietnamese handcuffs right there. And they walked out. And I thought, this ain't a big deal. And about 5 minutes later, my hands were numb, my arms were numb, and shortly my shoulders were numb, and pretty soon my chest was numb. And so I started walking around so I could keep myself alert and active, I thought. Next thing I knew, I'm laying on the floor. I'd obviously fallen like that. And I did that 3 or 4 times till I just gave up, quit trying to walk around. And during the mealtime, that mealtime came, he comes in with a bowl of soup and a plate of rice and holds it up. And I said, oh, good. We're going to get a break here, get something to eat. He holds it up, sets it on the table, and he does that. And I shook my head. He walked over and picked it up and walked out. Maybe they are serious about this. Okay, I'll lay here a while longer. So I guess I passed out off and on, because the next time, the afternoon meal time came, he comes in with a soup and rice again, sets it down to it. I said, no. But I had been conscious enough during the time that I realized I hadn't seen another American. I've been here for 4 days now. And this was the funny part. I haven't felt my hands all day. This is into the afternoon. I haven't felt anything from my waist up in a good while. If I can't use my hands, I can't feed myself, and I probably can't play golf again. So when he starts to pick up the stuff to go away, I said, wait a minute. And he turned around, does that, and I said, I'll try. He picks it up. I said, okay. He turned around and nodded my head. He wouldn't leave till I said yes. So he left the suit, went out and got the officer, came back, and the officer asked me, and I tried with him, I'll try. And he shook his head. So I said, okay. So he takes the handcuffs off, and I'd been through rope tying up before, and when they do that, the whole purpose is to cut off circulation, and when they release it, it's like grabbing an electric wire. If you've ever been shocked, by a house girl. Well, this time when it came off, I just shook all over. And they brought in a little booklet, like I never had it down here, but they're called test booklets, the little blue book sort of thing, lined with a whole thing of questions. Sit down and write. And so for about 3 or 4 days, I'd sit there and hold a pen in my mouth and push it around with my hands. And I'd get 6 or 8 words on a page that way and use up stuff. And there was questions, what's your name? And I put it down. What's your father's name? I put daddy. What's your mother's name? I put mommy. Where were you born? I put early age. Just Mickey Mouse. See, I don't know. I guess I was so beaten down by this point I didn't really care what they did. I was going to have some fun in the process. But they never referred to that again. And it proved, for me at least, the whole point was, we can make you do it. What that sergeant had said. We'll show you that we run this camp. You'll do what we tell you to do. So from then on, it's a game of how much I could keep them from doing. And then that night, when you were asking, this was really my low point when I ate that meal and realized that I had been broken. And so we had a big thunderstorm. It rained, and I was so thirsty. They hadn't given me any water except when the interrogator would be there, and he'd have a cup and offer it. And I remember I got up and I pulled the table over, put the chair on it, put the stool on it, and got up where I could get in this vent, and reached out and got a hold of a limb on the tree so that the rain coming down and run down, and I get some water off my arm. And then it quit raining about the time I got it. And so I went over and leaned up against a wall, just slumped down, and there was one light way over in the corner. And I looked up, and it just kept attracting my attention. And I remember thinking it was like Moses in the burning bush, I guess. And I sat there and I looked at the light. And whether it was a split second or an hour, I can't tell you. But I had an experience of something happened to me, and it was all over. I feel very comfortable, very secure. You're going to live, you're going to get out of this, and you'll go home someday. And from then on, I was able to accept things that happened, and when there would be a crackdown right after escape in a night camp and other things that would come down, you'd have a little sense that this might be bad. I could just think about it for a minute, and I could feel comfortable again and go on and do what I had to do. And I remember thinking Harry Truman made the statement as president that he had no trouble sleeping every night because he knew he had done the best that day that he knew to do, and he needed his rest for the next day. And I realized that I was able to do that. I could lie down every night and go to sleep no matter what was going on.
And how long had you been a prisoner when that happened?
I was shot down on Wednesday afternoon, and that was Saturday night.
So
3 days.
3 days after you were shot down, you feel you had a moment that gave you, I won't call it peace, but gave you something that got you through the rest of those years.
Yep.
Was there a day in that prison camp after that you didn't feel that awareness or didn't think about that? Or did that sustain you every single day?
I can't say that I thought it consciously every day, but the feeling was there every day.
And what do you think about that now? What do you think that was?
It still sustains me, and the experience that I had there after we were in those large groups, we started, after some confrontations with the Vietnamese, we started having Sunday church services. And I thought about it a lot. You know, what does this mean to me? What do I do? And I participated, not as an activist, but participated in the services, attended. And when I got home, I went to see another one of our classmates down here at Georgia Tech who had become an Episcopal minister. And I talked to him about it and asked him, you know, how did you make the transition? Because he had been a technical major. How did you make the transition to that? And told me experience. And the first assignment I had when I got back was at the Air War College. And one of my classmates there was a Catholic priest that I got to know fairly well. And I was still in this time, you know, I was saved in that ejection. I went through this other experience. What am I here for? And the Catholic priest helped me put it in the best perspective. He said, don't try to solve the problem. He said, you go through your life looking for the sign or looking for this or what. And he said, you may miss what you're actually here for. He said, just accept the fact that you're here and make the most of it that you can. And that's really what's been with me ever since.
Not like 5.5, almost 6 years a prisoner. How did you find out you were going home and when you were going home? And tell me about that experience.
Well, to put it all in perspective, when Nixon started the bombing again in May of '72. We were in the big prison there at Wallow, and somebody that went to quiz, as we called the interrogations, because it was easier to say and to tap, brought back a message that Nixon is crazy man. We don't know what happens now. But we had in our camp one South Vietnamese prisoner and 3 Thai prisoners who were allowed out to work and do things, and of course they were speaking the language, and they were really our intelligence. And we got a heads up that 209 was the number, literally, were going to be moved out of camp. And sure enough, about a week later, 209 of us were moved right up to the Chinese border, deep in the mountains, and a camp that we thought initially was new to us. We learned later on that others had been there ahead of us, who I don't know. But we spent the rest of '72 there and over the winter. And in October, we didn't have radios in each cell there. They didn't have power like we had back in the big prison. We had these little radios in each room, and you got these propaganda broadcasts. Hanoi Hana, we call it, the Voice of Vietnam, all the garbage. Up here, they had to do it by quizzes. And one of the fellows that went early picked up, they were asking him, what do you think about this proposed end of the war, or whatever? This is in early October. And then I was called out right at the end of October. And he asked me, he said, are you disappointed there was no settlement in October? I said, no, I didn't know there were going to be one, so how can I be disappointed for something I didn't know was going to happen, wasn't going to happen anyway? And kind of went on with that. And then, over Christmas and the holiday and New Year's, it got really cold, and we were settling in. All of us were looking to be there in the winter. And one night, the building I was in up the top of the hill, one of the fellows woke us up. They said, we just had 3 trucks come into camp. So we all stayed up and we counted 17 trucks. You don't need that many to bring in a month's load of food. Something is up. And the guards came around that morning and let us out to go out to eat or to shave, whatever we were going to do. We had a little area, kind of a little patio we could get out to in our building. And he looks around at one of the other guys, and he does this. And then he comes back like that, looks over and says, something is really up here. So we went back in, and just so we didn't miss out on it, we all started rolling up our gear. That afternoon, when the guard came around and opened it up, and he gives us this, which was a signal to roll up, ready to move, we just all leaned over and patted our roll. He got a big smile on his face, and right after dark, they loaded us on the trucks, headed back to Hanoi, and about halfway down mid-afternoon, we stopped and had a little coffee break. They gave us water and little energy bars, coconut bar stuff. And instead of getting back on the truck necessarily to your own, they divided us out in 4 categories. And what turned out to be the first 2 release groups went back to the big prison. The 3rd release group went to one we called a plantation, and the 4th one went to the zoo. And, excuse me, we'd been back about a week, and I was at the plantation in the 3rd group. They called us out one afternoon. We lined up, and the camp commander came over, and he read us the protocol from the Paris Treaty that in itself required that the prisoners be notified within 48 hours of this date. And they were told it, and they stood there for a few minutes waiting for us to do something, and when we didn't, they said, okay, dismissed, and we all filed back into our own little cells, and then we went up hugging each other. So, God, I hope it's true, hope it's true. And in my particular case, I was pulled out and taken up to Wallow. It turns out that after the first release group there was a little difference of opinion between, and the conditions for release were that everybody would be released in 4 equal increments over the next 60 days. So, and with the sick and wounded being released first. Well, the U.S. expected that to be release the sick and wounded, then 4 more increments. The Vietnamese interpreted to be the sick and wounded would be in the first increment. So they had a little hassle about that. And somehow they came up and released 20 guys, just pulled almost at random, came out. So as that was going on, I was pulled up to the second release group. Then they decided, no, the count didn't work, so I went back to the plantation. And then they pulled me out again. And whatever the problem was, we were supposed to be released on the 1st of March. And the camp commander came in, and we had the big, going away thing, special dinner, blah, 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 on the night of, last night in February. And then he told us, he said, maybe you do not go tomorrow. There is a small problem. I will let you know. So the next morning he comes in and said, I don't think so today. And that night he said, maybe tomorrow. And then by March the 3rd, we were said, oh, to hell with it. I hope somebody got out of here anyway. And he came in that night and he says, I think tomorrow, okay. And sure enough, the next morning he comes in and came in. There was a group called the, I forget the exact name, but they were an Indian, a Canadian, a Czech, and another Soviet Union type. Had to come around and inspect everybody. So they came through. We figured, I think we might make it today. And sure enough, about an hour later, we started going out. We got our go-home clothes that we'd been fitted for. We went out to pick them up, put them on. And they walked us out the front gate, and they had their little 20-seat buses out there, and we all got on and headed over to Jialam for the big trip home.
I'd like to hear this.
Well, we got out there as we pulled out onto the ramp, and I saw that 141 out there. Of course, working out there, my neighbor at Craig had gotten out of the Air Force and was test pilot in 141, and I'd walked out into one just before I left to go to Southeast Asia. And I saw that airplane, the United States of America, and that big flag up there. And I told a lot of people, when I walked down and walked up that ramp, I could smell the red clay out of North Georgia. I knew I was going home.
Is that just an expression, or did you really feel like you smelled? I mean,
I started feeling like I'm headed home, yeah.
Well, the one question I want to ask you, the penultimate, next to the last, is a lot of things changed for you while you were a prisoner. You found out about losing your father and losing other family members and your wife. And again, if you don't mind my asking, what sustained you through that?
Well, I had premonitions, or indications, I guess you'd say, on both. I only got 2 letters from my wife, and there were 6 lines, but she only used about 4 of them. So all she just said was, the children are fine, they help a lot. Another one was, I moved to Atlanta to go to Emory, the children doing well. You could almost read into it the indifference. And in the case of my dad, the one thing that I got from my mother was a birthday card that was signed Love, Mother. And that was probably one of the really low points when I realized he was gone, because I was looking forward to seeing him. I knew he was in bad shape when I left, but I was looking forward to going back and seeing him again. And so when I got there to Clark, we'd been there, 3 or 4 hours, and he came around and got me and said, there's a colonel up here who wants to see you. And he introduced himself from 13th Air Force headquarters. And we were standing in the doorway to the little ward area that I was in, and I looked up, and a technician that had been seeing me around was leaned up to the desk up here about 20, 30 feet. And I don't know why I turned around, there was another technician back standing around over here. this is not going to be a standard conversation. What is it? So he started out casually, told me about my aunt dying and my uncle dying and my father-in-law dying, and then your father died, and then your wife got a divorce. And as I've described it, it wasn't a surprise, it was the shock of confirmation. The things I was hoping weren't true, but I had a sense. And it was kind of ironic when I learned about more detail about my wife's divorce. When I was up in the mountains and I hadn't gotten anything, heard anything, I went to a quiz and I asked an officer whom I'd known from way back at the zoo. I said, I hadn't heard anything from my wife in a long time. I said, I'm wondering if maybe something has happened. I said, no, I think everything's fine. And I said, well, I would really like to know. I don't want my children to be hurting or having any problem. He said, okay, I ask. And several months later, I went to quiz with him again, and he said, I asked. He said, I think everything okay. As it turns out, that first quiz was within a week of when she filed for the divorce, and the second one was within a week of when it was granted. And they had sent the paperwork to Hanoi to camp a detention, and since I didn't reply within 30 days, I wasn't contesting it. Well, I was still going through the checkout down at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, but my mother wanted to get the family together at home and visit, and so I flew up commercially, and my ex-wife was here in town at the time. She came out and picked me up at the airport, and we went over to her house, and we were talking. I was going to take my children out with me for this party, and we were sitting there talking. She said, how you plan on getting to Bremen? I said, oh, gosh. Thought it didn't cross my mind. Oh, well, I'll rent a car. Oh, no, I guess I can't do that. I don't have a driver's license. Why? I didn't think of riding the bus. I don't know, because that'd been right off the bat. I thought, well, maybe Pat will rent me an airplane, because I had a pilot's license, commercial license, and I wasn't thinking of the fact that you got to have a medical to make it effective. But she said, well, you better do something. So this is getting kind of late if you're going out there tomorrow. So I called him up. I don't know, I guess we were looking at the phone book. I got him at home. And I said, hey, you got any airplane you might rent out tomorrow? He says, what for? I said, well, I need to get out to Bremen with me and the children. He said, when you want to go? And I said, oh, sometime mid-morning or so. And he says, hold on a minute. He looked around and he said, how's about 10 o'clock? Would that be good? 10:30? I said, yeah, it'd be fine. So he said, well, you know how to get out to my place? And I said, yeah. He said, all right, I'll see you then. So we come driving up out here, and it turns out he had a demonstration set up for a hoped-for sale with a King Air, I think it was. Anyways, about an 8 or 10 place airplane. And this company, people were here, and they were really nice, welcomed us in. And said, yeah, we'll be glad. And they gave me a ride out to West Georgia Airport, and my brother was there to pick me up. But Pat and I have laughed about that a lot of times.
Those 6 years of your life that you literally gave to this country, and all that happened to you, what would you say to young people? Or what would you, if you could get them all to pay attention to you for the next minute, what would you say?
Well, first I would say that I'm proud of my service. At the time I was there, I honestly believed that we were doing something that needed to be done, because the threat of communism and the expansion of China and their efforts to, particularly in Asia and in Southeast Asia, could have had very difficult future. And while we did not win, and unfortunately I think I have to say we actually did win the combat. Our politicians gave it away later on. But we did accomplish a stalemate, so to speak, and I think we stopped that expansion, gave those countries a chance to get on a little firmer basis. As far as Vietnamese people, I was disappointed for them, the boat people, that many were killed or died in the process of getting out of there. And in Cambodia, that were literally killed during the Pol Pot regime. I don't think we can take any pride at all in allowing that to happen. But when we finally started recognizing the Vietnamese, I was asked by one of the local stations, what do you think about it with the trade and then the recognition? And I said, well, we're going over there to give them a chance for self-determination, and it looks like they're finally going to get it. And on the 2 trips I've made back over there, I think we really did win the hearts and minds, because they really like Americans there now. But for the status now and the condition and the future of this country, I have real concern. The last few years, the mood of the country, the culture of the country, society have changed in ways that I cannot say that I feel proud about. But I do talk to enough young people who have good attitudes and good patriotic values that I'm optimistic that they will rise.
Only biography, unquote. The fact is, people make history. It's from the threads of the lives of countless individuals who were called to serve that the whole cloth of history is woven. Yes, we could find the history of the T-28 or the secret war in Laos in books or on the internet, but not the story. For that, we need to listen to those who flew the airplanes and fought that war. We need to see their eyes and hear their voices. We need to look at the cockpits they looked at before strapping in and flying off into the unknown. For that, we need a place, a garden, where history remains organic. For that, we need Warbirds in Review. You cannot place statues or build memorials in thin air. These airplanes, rescued, restored, returned to the sky, are the memorials. Through them, we give enduring thanks to those who gave everything they had to defend everything that we hold dear. By sharing them, we remind each other of the sacrifice. By sharing them, we introduce our heirs to their heritage. One week each summer, these national treasures are flown here. Twice each day, those who restored them present them to those who risked their lives to fight in them. And those who really did it tell the rest of us how it really was. It is a singular series of history lessons that anyone who cherishes liberty ought to see. It's called the world's greatest aviation celebration. For 1 week every summer during the annual fly-in convention of the Experimental Aircraft Association, Whitman Regional Airport in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, executes more flight operations than any other airport on Earth. So much happens here, it is physically impossible for one person to see it all. It's much more than an airplane rally. For example, history lives here this week. Here, the latest generation doesn't hear about the greatest generation. It hears from them in forums that are held twice daily called Warbirds in Review.
The idea for Warbirds in Review started several years ago. On our many trips to Oshkosh, we find that people are very interested in the airplanes. When you're pre-flighting an airplane or when you're working on it, the crowd would gather. So we said, why don't we do a formal time frame to just allow people to come visit with the pilot. But initially, it was to have the aircraft owner in front of their airplane and set a time when people could come and know that they would be able to hear about the airplane. From that, it evolved into, well, if we're going to have the P-51 here and someone talk about it, and you have the old Crow airplane, wouldn't it be wonderful if people could hear Bud Anderson's story? Wouldn't it be wonderful if people could hear from Jack Roush how he restored the airplane? So from that idea, it has grown and to a point that maybe it's a little too hard to handle, but the rewards are great.
The best way to describe these forums may be to call them reunions that consist of several layers. They begin with a reunion of the spectators with the era in which the airplane and the veterans served. Often the forums include heartwarming reunions of people who served together in harm's way. And they always include moving reunions of veterans with the aircraft they flew in our defense. Sam Bass has been helping host and moderate Warbirds in Review presentations since they began 12 years ago. He's an Air Force veteran, retired Delta Airlines captain, and a high-time volunteer warbird pilot, having flown EAA's B-17 aluminum overcast on its goodwill tours for 20 years. All veterans are recognized at every forum.
We're going to be emphasizing the Vietnam War this week. And before I get started, could I have all the veterans stand up, please?
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.